This homeless billionaire story will break your heart. He was kneeling on the freezing pavement, begging a wealthy stranger for nothing more than his leftover dinner. To the world, he was just another invisible soul on the streets, completely broken and desperate. But when the billionaire finally looked into his eyes, something shocking happened. He didn't call security. Instead, he saw a secret hidden in the young man's backpack, a secret that would instantly change both of their lives forever. But who was this young man really? Before we reveal the unbelievable miracle that happened next, smash that subscribe button for more emotional stories. Drop your country in the comments right now. I'm replying to everyone. The autumn wind swept through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, carrying a bitter chill that forced people to tuck their chins into their expensive wool coats. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows across the crowded sidewalks. Amidst the rush of businessmen hurrying to the train stations and couples laughing on their way to high-end theaters, Marcus Vance walked with a slow, deliberate pace. He kept his head down, not out of fear, but out of a habit born from trying to remain invisible. He was 24 years old, a young African-American man with sharp, tired eyes and a frame that had grown noticeably thinner over the past few months. Marcus wore a faded black canvas jacket that had seen far better days. The zipper was broken near the collar, forcing him to hold it closed with one hand against the biting wind. His other hand tightly gripped the strap of a weathered canvas backpack slung over his right shoulder. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another struggling youth drifting through the metropolis. They did not see the fierce resilience burning beneath his quiet demeanor, nor did they know the discipline that kept him moving forward every single day. Marcus was a man who rarely spoke, believing that actions carried far more weight than empty words. He possessed a deep, unwavering loyalty to the few things that truly mattered to his heart, but lately, that loyalty felt like a crushing weight. The city around him was alive with wealth and comfort, a stark contrast to Marcus's daily reality. For the past 3 months, his home had been a tiny, windowless room in the basement of a crumbling apartment building on the outer edge of the city. The rent was cheap, but to Marcus, every dollar felt like a mountain to climb. His days were spent walking miles across the city, searching for any odd jobs that paid in cash at the end of the day. He cleaned floors, moved heavy crates at warehouses, and washed dishes in the backs of greasy diners where the managers did not ask for identification. Every evening ended the same way. Marcus would return to the bustling downtown district just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He did not come to enjoy the city's nightlife, or to spend money he did not have. Instead, he came to find a quiet corner near a public library or a coffee shop, leaning against the cold brick walls just to catch a glimpse of a different world. On this particular evening, his stomach growled fiercely, a sharp reminder that he had not eaten a solid meal in over 24 hours. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his entire fortune, 2 crumpled $1 bills and 3 shiny quarters. It was not even enough for a warm sandwich at a corner deli. Despite the hunger gnawing at his insides, Marcus adjusted his backpack, making sure the heavy, hexagonal shape inside was secure. It was a cheap, beat-up laptop, its silver casing scratched and dented from years of use. It was the only item of value he owned, yet he would rather starve than part with it. As Marcus watched the wealthy citizens of Chicago step into warm restaurants, he felt a familiar, heavy wave of unearned shame wash over him. He was doing everything right, working until his hands bled, yet the gap between his survival and total ruin was growing narrower by the hour. Marcus turned away from the bright restaurant windows and began the long 4-mile walk back to his basement room. The routine of his life had become a fragile rhythm, a delicate dance where one single misstep could shatter everything. To the rest of the world, Marcus was just a quiet young man who kept to himself. But beneath that calm exterior lay a reality that was rapidly fracturing. The next morning, the alarm on Marcus's cheap wristwatch buzzed at 5 o'clock. He woke up in the dark, the air in his windowless room damp and smelling of old pipes. He did not waste time feeling sorry for himself. He immediately sat up, rubbed his tired eyes, and reached for his backpack. His first priority every single morning was not breakfast, because there was no food in the small mini-fridge anyway, but checking the battery life of the beat-up silver laptop. He plugged it into the single working wall outlet, watching the small orange light flicker to life. Electricity in this basement was unstable, and Marcus often skipped buying a morning coffee, just to ensure he had enough quarters to feed the building's coin-operated power meter. The laptop had to remain charged. It had to stay alive. By 6 o'clock, Marcus was already at his main source of income, the Grace Community Center. The building was old, serving as a safe haven for neighborhood children and seniors. Marcus's job was to clean the entire facility before the doors opened to the public. He pushed a heavy mop across the scuffed linoleum floors of the gymnasium, his muscles aching from the lack of nourishment. The manager of the center, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, watched him from her office. She often noticed how Marcus would politely decline the complimentary donuts left in the break room, claiming he had already eaten a large breakfast at home. It was a lie born of pride. Marcus did not want charity. He wanted to earn his way. "You look a bit pale today, Marcus," Mrs. Gable said, as she handed him his weekly envelope of cash. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "I am doing just fine, Mrs. Gable." "Thank you," Marcus replied, offering a small, reassuring smile that did not reach his tired eyes. He took the envelope, feeling its thinness. When he stepped outside into the afternoon air, Marcus opened the envelope to count the bills. It was $45. His heart sank into his stomach. The math did not work. His weekly rent was exactly $100, and he was already late on the payment. He had promised his landlord, a harsh man named Mr. Henderson, that he would have the full amount by the end of the day. Marcus had spent the last 3 days searching for extra warehouse shifts, but the work simply wasn't there. He walked down the street, his mind racing with calculations. He could skip meals for the next 4 days. He could walk instead of taking the bus, saving a few extra dollars. But even with those desperate measures, the numbers refused to add up. The fragile normal he had fought so hard to maintain over the past few months was slipping through his fingers. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the city, Marcus realized he was walking toward a confrontation he could not avoid. The quiet stability he clung to was about to face its hardest test. Marcus arrived at the apartment building just as the streetlights flickered on, his boots heavy on the concrete steps leading down to the basement. Before he could even reach for his keys, the heavy metal door at the end of the hallway swung open. Mr. Henderson stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his face tight with impatience. There was no greeting, no polite inquiry about Marcus's day. The landlord simply held out a thick, calloused hand. "You are late, Marcus," Mr. Henderson said, his voice echoing loudly in the narrow, damp corridor. "I told you yesterday was the absolute deadline. Do you have the $100 or not?" Marcus felt a familiar, suffocating tightness in his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the thin envelope from the community center, along with the few loose bills he had saved from his previous odd jobs. He counted it out carefully, trying to keep his hand from shaking as he presented the money to the older man. "I have $95 right here, Mr. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice low, steady, and respectful. "I am only $5 short. I have a cleaning shift tomorrow morning at dawn, and I can give you the remaining $5 by noon. I promise you." Mr. Henderson looked down at the money in Marcus's hand, then looked up at the young man's tired face. He did not take the cash. Instead, he let out a harsh, dry sigh and shook his head. $95 is not 100, Marcus. This is the 3rd time this month you have been short, and I have a waiting list of people who can pay the full amount on time. I cannot run a business on promises. "Please," Marcus urged, his grip tightening on his backpack strap. "It is just $5. It's freezing outside tonight." "I gave you fair warning," Mr. Henderson replied coldly. He stepped aside, revealing 2 cardboard boxes sitting on the floor next to Marcus's room. Inside the boxes were Marcus's few clothes, a spare pair of shoes, and his old blanket. The lock on his door had already been changed. "Your stuff is packed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You need to leave the premises tonight." The rejection hit Marcus like a physical blow to the stomach. For a moment, the world around him went completely silent. The humiliation was overwhelming, burning hot in his throat. He had worked himself to the bone, skipped meals, and swallowed his pride. Yet it still was not enough to keep a roof over his head. Without another word, because he knew arguing would change nothing, Marcus knelt down and picked up the heavy boxes. He carried them up the stairs one by one, setting them on the sidewalk under the cold, gray Chicago sky. He sat on one of the boxes for an hour, the biting wind cutting straight through his broken jacket zipper. He had nowhere to go, no friends to call, and no family left in this city. His stomach roared with a sharp, painful emptiness. It had now been 2 full days since his last real meal. The hunger was no longer just a dull ache. It was a driving, desperate force. Marcus pulled his backpack open to ensure the beat-up silver laptop was untouched and safe from the cold. Seeing it gave him a flicker of resolve. He slung the backpack over his shoulder, left the heavy cardboard boxes behind on the sidewalk, and began walking toward the bright, wealthy lights of the downtown restaurant district, driven entirely by a desperate need to survive the night. Marcus walked until the quiet residential streets gave way to the glittering, high-end district of downtown. The contrast was sharper than ever. Here the air smelled of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and burning firewood from outdoor patio heaters. Well-dressed patrons laughed and chatted under the canopy of a luxurious sidewalk restaurant. Completely insulated from the freezing wind, Marcus stopped a few yards away, his body trembling uncontrollably from a mixture of intense cold and profound exhaustion. He stood near a decorative iron railing, watching a waiter place a thick, perfectly seared steak onto the table of a solitary diner. The diner was Arthur Sterling. Arthur looked to be in his late 50s, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that screamed quiet wealth. He was looking at his smartphone, occasionally glancing out at the city skyline with a cold, detached expression. He took a few small bites of his meal, then pushed the plate aside, barely touching more than half of the expensive meat. He signaled the waiter, indicating he was finished. Seeing that plate about to be taken away caused something to snap inside Marcus. The overwhelming hunger, the humiliation of his eviction, and the sheer desperation of his situation collided, wiping away his usual quiet restraint. He could not think about tomorrow. He could only think about the agonizing emptiness in his stomach right now. Swallowing every ounce of his remaining pride, Marcus stepped over the boundary of the restaurant's patio. Before the staff or security could even notice him, he approached Arthur's table. He did not ask for money. He did not make a scene. Instead, Marcus dropped to his knees on the freezing concrete floor right beside the billionaire's table. "Can I have your leftovers, sir?" Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. He kept his head bowed at first, the shame burning hot in his chest. He felt the eyes of the neighboring diners instantly lock onto him. He heard the sharp, offended gasp of a woman at a nearby table and the sudden hurried footsteps of the restaurant manager rushing toward them. Marcus knew how he looked to them. A threat, a nuisance, a stereotype. The fear of being arrested or beaten by security made his heart hammer against his ribs, but he did not move. He remained on his knees, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, physically putting himself at the mercy of a total stranger. Arthur Sterling froze, his fork hovering inches from his plate. He turned his head slowly, looking down at the young black man kneeling on the pavement. Arthur's face was an unreadable mask of corporate coldness, accustomed to people begging for his money or his attention every single day. For a long, agonizing 5 seconds, neither man said a word. The silence between them grew so heavy that even the ambient noise of the street seemed to fade away. Marcus slowly raised his eyes, forcing himself to look directly into the eyes of the billionaire. It was a plea stripped of all pretense, a raw display of human vulnerability that asked not just for food, but for the basic recognition that he was still a human being. Arthur Sterling stared down at the young man, his eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared to deliver his usual cold, dismissive rejection. He had no interest in street charity, and he despised being interrupted during his private dinners. "Sir, is this man bothering you?" The restaurant manager had finally arrived, his face flushed with anger as 2 burly security guards flanked him from behind. The manager reached out to grab Marcus's arm to pull him up from the floor, but Marcus didn't resist. He simply moved his shoulder slightly to protect his backpack. In doing so, the worn-out canvas zipper of his bag slid open a few inches further. Arthur opened his mouth to tell the guards to take Marcus away, but his words died in his throat. His gaze dropped from Marcus's face to the open gap in the backpack. The silver edge of the beat-up laptop was fully visible now, but it wasn't the laptop itself that caught Arthur's attention. It was a small, glowing blue sticker pasted onto the corner of the silver casing, highly stylized, unique emblem of a phoenix rising from a digital grid. Arthur's breath hitched. His hands, usually perfectly still and controlled, gripped the edge of the glass table so hard his knuckles turned white. He knew that exact emblem. It was not a mass-produced sticker. It was a custom design created by only one person in the world. "Wait," Arthur commanded, his voice sharp and authoritative, cutting through the manager's frantic apologies. The security guards froze in their tracks. The manager looked confused, his hand hovering in midair. "Mr. Sterling, can have him removed immediately. There is no need for." "I said wait," Arthur repeated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. He kept his eyes locked on the laptop sticker, a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and a sudden, painful memory flashing across his face. He looked back up at Marcus, truly examining the young man's facial features for the first time. He saw the structure of the jawline, the specific depth of the eyes. Strange, unexpected spark of recognition ignited in the billionaire's mind. Arthur slowly leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from cold detachment to intense, hyper-focused curiosity. He pointed a finger at the plate of steak that was about to be discarded. "Take the plate," Arthur said to Marcus, his voice lowering to a quiet, intense murmur. "And don't eat it on the floor. Stand up. Sit down right across from me." Marcus blinked, stunned by the sudden turn of events. The manager gasped, and the surrounding diners whispered in hushed, shocked tones. Marcus hesitated, his body still tense from the fear of being attacked, but the genuine intensity in Arthur's eyes told him this was not a joke. Marcus slowly pushed himself up from the cold concrete, his knees stiff and aching, and picked up the plate. He pulled out the heavy leather chair opposite the billionaire and sat down, his faded canvas jacket a stark contrast against the white tablecloth. He had only asked for a piece of leftover food, but a completely unexpected encounter had just opened a door he never saw coming. Marcus sat stiffly in the plush chair, the savory aroma of the warm steak hitting his senses, making his hands tremble. He picked up the silver fork, his fingers clumsy from the cold, and took a small, careful bite. He ate with quiet discipline, refusing to gorge himself despite the desperate hunger clawing at his stomach. Arthur watched him intensely, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. The silence between them was thick, but outside their little bubble, the restaurant was in an uproar. The manager stepped forward again, his face twisted in deep discomfort as he looked at the other wealthy patrons who were staring and whispering. "Mr. Sterling, please," the manager pleaded in a hushed, urgent tone. "This is highly inappropriate for our establishment. We cannot allow a homeless person to dine at our front tables. It is disrupting the other guests." Arthur did not even look up at the manager, merely raised one hand, snapping his fingers coldly. "I own the commercial block this entire restaurant sits on, Julian. If you say another word to this young man, I will terminate your lease by tomorrow morning. Leave us." The manager's face drained of color. He bowed his head quickly, signaled the security guards to stand down, and retreated into the building. The surrounding diners immediately turned their heads away, realizing that the billionaire was protecting the youth. But the protection came with a heavy, suffocating price. As soon as the manager left, Arthur leaned across the table, his face turning incredibly stern, his eyes narrowing like a predator targeting its prey. The initial shock on his face had hardened into suspicion. "You have exactly 2 minutes to answer my questions," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "And if you lie to me, I will personally ensure the police are here within 3 minutes." Marcus paused, his fork hovering in the air. He looked at Arthur, feeling a cold dread replace the warmth of the food. Arthur pointed a finger directly at the open gap in Marcus's backpack. "That laptop. That specific blue phoenix emblem belongs to a highly encrypted proprietary software prototype. It was designed by a brilliant tech engineer who died exactly 1 year ago. The technology is worth millions, and the master key disappeared with him. So tell me, young man Y is a starving beggar on the streets of Chicago, carrying a dead genius's most guarded secret?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. The environment around him suddenly felt hostile again, much worse than before. The conflict had mutated from a simple matter of poverty into a terrifying accusation. Marcus could see it in Arthur's eyes. The billionaire didn't see a hungry youth anymore, saw a thief, a criminal who had somehow stripped a dead man of his final, most valuable possession. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the weight of the situation threatened to crush him completely. The few bites of food he had managed to swallow suddenly felt like lead in his stomach. The ambient sounds of the city, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of traffic all faded into a deafening silence. He looked down at his own worn-out, calloused hands, then at the sharp, accusing glare of the powerful man sitting across from him. He had reached his lowest point. Just an hour ago, he thought. Losing his room was the worst thing that could happen to him. But now, he was being looked at as a common thief, a parasite, who had desecrated a dead man's legacy. The injustice of it all burned like acid in his chest. Marcus had spent the last 12 months working himself to the bone, refusing to sell the laptop even when he couldn't afford a single loaf of bread, all to protect what was left of his family. And yet, because he was a young black man in a torn jacket, kneeling on a sidewalk, the immediate assumption was that he had stolen it. "I didn't steal it," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a profound, heavy sorrow. "That is not an answer," Arthur countered coldly, tapping his fingers on the table. "Ah! A prototype like that doesn't just fall into the hands of a street beggar. If you cannot explain how you got it, I am calling the police. I knew the man who built that machine, and I will not let his work be degraded." Marcus looked toward the street. He could run. He was young and fast, and the security guards were still hesitant. He could grab his backpack, sprint into the dark alleyways of the city, and disappear into the night. But if he ran, he would forever validate Arthur's suspicion. He would become the thief they all thought he was, and the memory of the person who gave him that laptop would be tarnished forever. Worse, Marcus knew he had no resources left. His body was exhausted, his pockets were empty, and his spirit was fractured. If the police were called, he had no money for a lawyer, no permanent address, and no way to prove his innocence in a legal system that often looked at people like him with innate distrust. All his efforts to live with dignity, to follow the rules, and to keep his promise had led him right here, sitting in a luxury restaurant, facing a billionaire who held his entire future in the palm of his hand, completely powerless. Every hope he had nurtured about turning his life around seemed to evaporate into the freezing autumn air. The silver laptop inside his bag felt like a curse rather than a treasure. He was entirely alone in a city of millions, stripped of his pride, stripped of his home, and now about to be stripped of his freedom. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second, feeling the stinging threat of tears, but he forced them back. He refused to cry in front of a man who viewed him as a criminal, took a deep, shaky breath, knowing that the next few seconds would decide whether he survived or fell into complete ruin. Marcus made his decision. He did not run. He did not yell, nor did he offer a frantic defense to save himself. Instead, a calm, heavy dignity settled over his features. He reached down, unzipped his canvas backpack completely, and carefully lifted the beat-up silver laptop out into the open light. The surrounding patrons watched in hushed suspense as Marcus placed the machine gently onto the white tablecloth, right between his plate of food and the billionaire. He pushed the laptop across the table, turning it around so that it faced Arthur Sterling. "I am not a thief, sir," Marcus said, his voice quiet, steady, and devoid of fear. He extended his right hand, his fingers hovering over the worn plastic keyboard. With a practiced, fluid motion, he typed in a complex, 20-character password that only a handful of people in the tech world would ever understand. The screen flickered to life, bypassing layers of heavy military-grade encryption until a clean desktop interface appeared. Marcus withdrew his hands, placed them flat on his lap, and looked directly into Arthur's eyes. "The system is fully unlocked," Marcus said, his tone entirely open, offering no resistance. "Every file, every line of code, and the entire proprietary framework is right there. If you believe I stole this, call the police. I will sit right here and wait for them. I will give you full control of this machine, because I would rather lose the laptop than let you believe I dishonored the man who built it." It was a massive, incredibly risky gamble. By unlocking the machine and giving it to Arthur, Marcus was handing over a technology worth tens of millions of dollars, the only thing that connected him to his past, and his only potential ticket out of poverty. He was completely defenseless, choosing total, unvarnished honesty over self-preservation. He trusted that truth, even when delivered by a man on his knees, had power. Arthur's eyes widened as he looked at the glowing screen. He did not reach for his phone to call the authorities. Instead, his hands trembled slightly as he pulled the laptop closer to his chest. His fingers flew across the trackpad, clicking through directories, verifying the digital signatures embedded deep within the software. The billionaire's face changed from one of cold suspicion to utter profound shock. The absolute vulnerability of the young man sitting across from him, combined with the flawless validation of the encrypted data, shattered Arthur's corporate armor. He looked up from the screen, his breath catching in his throat as the puzzle pieces of the last 12 months finally began to fall into place. The patrons in the restaurant thought Marcus was just a random, desperate beggar who had stumbled onto a wealthy patio, asking a rich stranger for a miracle to save his life. But it turns out, Arthur Sterling had been desperately searching for Marcus for an entire year to hand over a multi-million-dollar tech partnership and fulfill a dying promise. Because since the very beginning, Julian Vansa, brilliant software engineer who had passed away a year ago, was Marcus's older brother. Julian had been Arthur's chief engineer, and together, they were building a revolutionary artificial intelligence infrastructure. Before Julian tragically succumbed to his illness, he completed the final master framework. However, knowing the immense greed of corporate competitors, Julian chose not to upload it to the company's servers. Instead, he locked it inside his old personal laptop, applied a unique blue phoenix sticker to the casing, and handed it to his younger brother. On his deathbed, Julian had looked at Arthur and said, "My brother Marcus holds the key to our future. He doesn't know a thing about coding, but he is the most honest man I know. He will protect it with his life. If he ever brings it to you, trust him completely." For 12 long months, Arthur had been searching for a man named Marcus Vance. But because Julian had kept his family life fiercely private, Arthur had no photos, no address, and no contact information. All Arthur knew was that Julian's brother lived somewhere in Chicago. Out of sheer hope, Arthur had spent the last 52 weeks dining at this exact street-side restaurant every single Tuesday evening, sitting at the same front table, hoping that by some cosmic stroke of luck, Julian's brother might recognize him from the news and approach him. "You are Julian's brother," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. The cold, calculated billionaire was entirely gone, replaced by a man filled with profound awe. "You are Marcus." Marcus stared at him, his mouth slightly open, the shock completely paralyzing him. How? How do you know my brother's name?" "Because your brother was my partner, and he was my friend," Arthur said, a tear finally escaping his eye and sliding down his cheek. He looked at the 20-character password Marcus had typed, a password that consisted of Julian's birth date and initials. "He told me about your honesty, Marcus. He told me you would never compromise your integrity. For a year, I have been looking for you to hand over 50% of a multi-million-dollar foundation that belongs to your family. And you were right here, starving on the pavement, protecting his legacy." The restaurant manager, who was watching from the doorway, stood frozen in absolute disbelief. The diners who had gasped and discussed just minutes ago were now staring with wide, watery eyes, completely captivated by the unbelievable miracle unfolding right before them on the sidewalk. The young man who had been kicked out of his home for being $5 short was in reality the rightful heir to a tech empire. 6 months later, the bitter autumn chill of Chicago had given way to the gentle warmth of a bright spring afternoon. The bustling sidewalk restaurant was just as lively as it had been on that fateful night, filled with the cheerful chatter of patrons and the clinking of glasses. But at the front table, the scene had completely transformed. Marcus Vance sat comfortably in one of the plush leather chairs, dressed in a sharp, well-fitted navy blue suit. His frame was no longer thin and hollow. Health and vitality had returned to his face, and his eyes, once clouded with exhaustion and unearned shame, now shone with confidence and peace. Sitting across from him was Arthur Sterling, looking on with a proud paternal smile. On the table between them lay a sleek, modern tablet displaying the official corporate registration of the Julian Vance Memorial Foundation, multi-million-dollar venture dedicated to providing tech, education, and housing for underprivileged youth. Marcus had been appointed as the co-director, ensuring that his brother's brilliant legacy would not only live on, but would actively lift others out of the darkness he had known so well. "We just crossed 10,000 student enrollments this morning, Marcus," Arthur said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Your brother would be incredibly proud of how you are managing his dream." Marcus looked down at the tablet, soft smile gracing his lips. "I just did what he asked me to do, Arthur. I kept the promise." Their quiet moment was gently interrupted when a young waiter approached their table, carrying a tray with 2 fresh meals. As the waiter set the plates down, Marcus noticed a teenager standing just past the restaurant's decorative iron railing. The boy was wearing an oversized, tattered hoodie, staring intensely at the food with a look of raw, unmistakable hunger. It was a mirror image of Marcus's own past, a painful reminder of the thin line between being seen and being invisible. Without a second thought, Marcus stood up from his chair. He picked up his untouched plate of warm food, walked over to the edge of the patio, and handed it directly to the startled teenager. Along with a small card containing the address of the foundation's shelter, the boy looked at the food, then up at Marcus, his eyes filling with tears of relief. Marcus simply nodded, offering a reassuring pat on the shoulder, before returning to his seat. Arthur watched the entire interaction in silent admiration. The young man who had once knelt on that very pavement begging for scraps was now standing tall, using his own blessing to rewrite the stories of others. The extraordinary journey of Marcus Vance reminds us that a person's current circumstances do not define their ultimate value, and adversity is often just a test of character. Integrity is a currency that never devalues, even when your pockets are completely empty. And keeping faith during your darkest night can lead you right to the doorstep of your greatest dawn. True miracles do not just happen by chance. They're born when unyielding honesty meets a heart willing to see the humanity in others.